What would you do if you unlocked your husband's phone and found detailed plans for your murder disguised as an accident? Would you run? Would you confront him? Or would you discover that the truth is far more twisted than you could ever imagine? Stay with us because this story will leave you breathless and questioning everything you thought you knew about love and betrayal. If you want more incredible true stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, hit that subscribe button for USA Diary right now, because you won't want to miss what happens next. #story. I found messages planning my death. I never thought checking my husband's phone would be the moment my entire world shattered into a million pieces. But there I was standing in our kitchen at 2 in the morning with my hands trembling so violently, I could barely hold the device as I read the words that would change everything I thought I knew about the man I had loved for 12 years. It started so innocently, the way all devastating discoveries do, with me reaching for what I thought was my phone on the nightstand in the darkness, and realizing only after I'd unlocked it with the passcode I'd seen him use 1,000 times that this wasn't my phone at all, and my first instinct was to put it back to respect his privacy, because that's what good wives do, right? But then I saw the notification preview from someone named Michael saying, "The break line plan is too risky, we need something cleaner." And suddenly my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest, and I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe something from a movie script or a book plot, because David was always talking about wanting to write a thriller someday. But my hands were already opening the message thread, and what I found there made my blood turn to ice in my veins, because there were weeks of messages, dozens of them, discussing in meticulous detail how to make my death look like an accident. Talking about my daily routines, my morning jogs through the state park, the way I always took the same route at the same time, the medications I took for my anxiety that could be increased without anyone knowing, the faulty wiring in the basement that could start a fire while I was sleeping upstairs. And I read every single word with tears streaming down my face, as the man I had built a life with, the man who had held me through my mother's death and promised to love me forever, had apparently been planning to murder me for insurance money. At least that's what I thought, until I kept reading and found messages about keeping Emma safe and making sure she never finds out the truth. And Emma, that's me, that's my name, and nothing made sense anymore, because why would they want to keep me safe if they were planning to kill me? I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to make my brain process what I was seeing, trying to find some rational explanation that didn't end with my husband wanting me dead. And that's when I heard the toilet flush upstairs, and I knew David would be coming back to bed any second. And I had maybe 30 seconds to decide what to do with this information that was burning a hole through my consciousness, so I did the only thing I could think of. I took photos of everything, every single message thread, every detail of their horrible plans, and I sent them to my own phone, and then I deleted the evidence that I'd sent anything, and I put his phone back exactly where I found it, and I slipped back into bed beside the man who might be planning to kill me. And I laid there in the darkness with my eyes wide open, listening to him breathe, and wondering if tonight was supposed to be the night, or if I still had time to figure out what to do. Sleep never came, and when dawn finally broke through our bedroom curtains, I got up and went through the motions of our normal morning routine, making coffee and toast and pretending everything was fine, while my mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. And David came downstairs looking exactly like he always did, in his gray suit and blue tie, kissing my forehead and asking if I'd slept well, and I heard myself say, "Yes, fine, how about you?" as if my entire world had just collapsed. And he said something about a big meeting at work and grabbed his briefcase and left. And the moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I ran to my phone and looked at those screenshots again, hoping I imagined it all, hoping it was some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But no, there they were, as real and terrible as they'd been in the middle of the night. I knew I should call the police, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the part of the messages that talked about keeping me safe. Maybe it was 12 years of loving this man making me want to believe there had to be more to the story, or maybe I was just in shock. But instead of calling 911, I called my sister Rachel. And when she answered, I started sobbing so hard I couldn't speak, and she immediately said she was coming over, and 20 minutes later she was sitting on my couch reading through the screenshots with her hand over her mouth, and her face getting paler with every swipe. And when she finished, she looked at me and said, "We need to go to the police right now, Emma. This is serious. He's planning to murder you." But I shook my head and told her something didn't add up about the messages, about the way they kept mentioning keeping me safe, and she argued with me, said I was in denial, that I was making excuses for him because I didn't want to believe the truth. But I insisted that I needed to understand what was really happening before I did anything irreversible. And finally, after an hour of back and forth, she agreed to help me figure it out, but only if I promised to stay at her house where I'd be safe. And so I packed a bag and told David via text that Rachel was having a crisis and needed me for a few days. And he responded immediately with concern, asking if everything was okay, if there was anything he could do. And I stared at that message, wondering how someone could sound so caring while planning something so monstrous. At Rachel's house, I became obsessed with those messages, reading them over and over again, looking for clues I'd missed. And that's when I noticed something strange. The timestamp showed that most of the messages were sent during David's work hours, but I knew from the times I called him at the office that he was usually in meetings or with clients during those exact windows. So how was he having these extensive text conversations? And then I noticed something else. Michael, whoever he was, kept referring to the target and the subject in some messages, but then would slip and use Emma in others, like he couldn't keep his story straight. And there was one message I'd almost overlooked where David had written, "I can't believe it's come to this. I never wanted to involve her, but we're running out of time." And the more I analyzed every word, the more convinced I became that something else was going on, something I couldn't quite see yet. Rachel thought I was losing it when I told her I wanted to follow David to see who this Michael person was. But she also knew me well enough to know I wouldn't let it go. So the next morning we sat in her car outside David's office building, waiting for him to emerge. And when he finally did at lunchtime, we followed him through downtown traffic to a coffee shop in a part of town he never usually went to, and we watched through the window as he met with a man I'd never seen before, late 40s, graying hair, wearing an expensive suit, and they sat in a corner booth having what looked like an intense conversation, and I took photos of them together. And then Rachel had the idea to go inside and sit at a nearby table to see if we could hear anything, so we did, acting casual, ordering lattes and pretending to be absorbed in our phones while we strained to catch pieces of their conversation. What I heard made everything even more confusing, because the man I assumed was Michael was saying something about the organization and how much longer can we keep her in the dark, and David was insisting she can know it would put her in more danger. And we have to make it look convincing or they'll know we're onto them. And Michael said, the break line idea was amateur hour. We need something that will actually draw them out, make them show their hand. And I was gripping my coffee cup so hard I thought it might shatter, because what organization, what danger, who were they? And why did everything I heard make me more confused instead of less? And then Michael said something that made my heart stop. He said, "Your wife is stronger than you think, David. She survived what they did to her sister. She can survive this." And I looked at Rachel, and her face had gone white, because our sister Sarah, our middle sister, had died 5 years ago in what the police had ruled a random mugging gone wrong. She'd been walking home from work when someone attacked her and took her purse and stabbed her and left her bleeding in an alley, and we'd never gotten answers, never found who did it. and the case had gone cold, and now this stranger was suggesting it wasn't random at all. I stood up without thinking and walked straight to their table, and both men looked up in shock as I slammed my hands down and demanded to know what the hell was going on and what did Sarah have to do with anything. And David's face went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds: shock, fear, resignation, and finally something like relief, and he said, "Emma. Oh God, Emma, you weren't supposed to find out like this." And Michael was already on his feet reaching into his jacket, and I thought he was going for a gun, but instead he pulled out a badge and said, "Mrs. Crawford, I'm Special Agent Michael Torres with the FBI, and I think you'd better sit down because we have a lot to explain to you." And my legs gave out and Agent Torres and David exchanged a look, and then Torres began to talk, and what he told me sounded like something out of a movie. He said that 5 years ago when Sarah died, it hadn't been a random mugging at all. She had accidentally witnessed something she shouldn't have seen, something involving a human trafficking ring operating in our city, and they'd killed her to keep her quiet. But what the traffickers didn't know was that Sarah had managed to send a text to David before she died. She and David had been close. They'd worked together at his law firm, and she'd texted him a photo she'd secretly taken of the men she'd seen loading girls into a van, and David had gone to the police. But the corruption went deeper than anyone knew, and within days someone had broken into David's office and stolen his computer and his files, and he received anonymous threats saying that if he pursued it any further I would be next, and so he gone to the FBI instead, and had been working undercover with them for the past 5 years trying to build a case against the trafficking organization from the inside. My head was spinning as Torres explained that David had been pretending to be a corrupt lawyer, willing to help the organization with legal issues to gain their trust and gather evidence, but recently the traffickers had become suspicious. They thought David might be working with law enforcement, and they started making threats against me directly, saying they would kill me and make it look like an accident to punish David for betraying them. And so David and the FBI had hatched a plan. They would stage my death themselves, make it convincing enough that the traffickers would believe it was real and think they'd succeeded in their revenge, and then they could move me into witness protection while they finished building their case and made the arrests. The messages I'd found weren't David planning to kill me. They were David and Agent Torres planning to fake my death to save my life. And I sat there unable to speak, unable to process this complete inversion of everything I thought I knew. And David was crying now, actual tears running down his face as he said, "I'm so sorry, Emma. I never wanted to lie to you, but they said if you acted any differently, they'd know something was wrong, and they've been watching us, and I couldn't risk them figuring it out. I couldn't lose you like we lost Sarah. I couldn't." And his voice broke, and despite everything, despite the fear and confusion and anger I felt, I also felt something else. I felt the truth of his words settling into my bones, and I realized that everything weird I noticed over the past few months, the way David had been distant and stressed, the mysterious phone calls he'd taken, another room, the times he encouraged me to vary my jogging route or had suggested I take a self-defense class. It had all been him trying to protect me in the only ways he could without revealing what was really happening. Rachel was demanding more answers, asking why they hadn't just arrested these people years ago, and Torres explained that it was a massive operation spanning multiple states with connections to officials in law enforcement and local government, and they needed time to build an airtight case to make sure everyone involved would go down, and they were close now, just weeks away from making their move. But the traffickers were getting desperate and sloppy, and their threats against me had become more specific, more urgent, and David had been terrified that they would act before the FBI was ready. And I asked the question that was burning in my mind. I asked if they'd really been planning to go through with it if I hadn't T found those messages. Would they really have faked my death without telling me? And David nodded slowly and said, "This weekend we were going to stage a car accident on your way to visit your aunt in Pennsylvania. You would have been pulled over by FBI agents posing as state police, told everything, and taken into protective custody, and I would have had to identify a body that wasn't you and grieve publicly, and God, Emma, I've been sick about it for weeks, knowing I was going to put you through that fear, but Torres convinced me it was the only way to keep you alive. And I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and fierce, because how dare they make that decision for me? How dare they plan to traumatize me without my consent, even if it was to save my life? I told them I was angry, I was furious, but I also told them I understood, and I asked what happened now that I knew, and Torres said that changed things, that we have to accelerate the timeline because the traffickers had people everywhere. And if they suspected I knew something was wrong, they might move against me immediately, and we needed to decide right then whether to go forward with the fake death plan. Now that I was aware of it, or to bring me into protective custody immediately and hide me away until the arrests were made. And I looked at David, really looked at him for the first time since sitting down, and I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he'd been carrying alone for 5 years. And I made a decision that surprised even myself. I said I wanted to help. I wanted to be part of taking these monsters down for Sarah and for all the girls they hurt. And Torres started to shake his head, saying it was too dangerous, but I cut him off and said they already made me a target, already stolen 5 years of honesty from my marriage, already killed my sister. And if there was something I could do to help end this, then I was going to do it. And David looked terrified but also proud, and he squeezed my hand and said, "Are you sure?" And I said I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. The next few days were a blur of FBI briefings and wire fittings, and learning how to act natural while wearing a recording device, and Torres explained the plan in detail. The traffickers had someone inside David's office, someone they didn't know the identity of yet, who was reporting back to them, and they needed to draw this person out. So I would go back home, I would resume my normal life, but I would have protective surveillance, 24/7 agents I never see watching my every move, and David would let slip to certain people at work that our marriage was in trouble, that I found out about an affair that we were fighting, and the hope was that the mole in his office would report this back to the traffickers, and they would see it as an opportunity, as a weakness they could exploit, and they might make contact with me directly to try to use me against David. And if they did, the FBI would be listening and recording, and they'd finally have the direct evidence they needed to connect the whole organization and make arrests that would stick. It was dangerous. Torres admitted it was asking me to be bait, but I was already bait. I'd been bait for 5 years without knowing it, and at least now I could be prepared and I could fight back. And so I agreed, and Rachel made me promise to be careful and to check in with her constantly. And I went home to the house I shared with my husband, the house that no longer felt safe, the house that was apparently being watched by murderers. Living a lie is harder than you'd think, especially when you reliving it with someone you love and having to pretend to be angry with them in public while stealing moments of real connection in the only room in our house that the FBI had swept for bugs, which was our bathroom of all places. And David and I would stand in the shower with the water running, whispering our real feelings, our real fears, and I'd cry and he'd hold me and promise that this would all be over soon, and then we turn off the water and go back to our performance of a marriage falling apart, and it was exhausting and surreal and terrifying all at once. 3 days into our charade, I was at the grocery store buying produce when a woman approached me in the aisle. She was young, maybe 25, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous energy that set off alarm bells, and she said, "Emma Crawford." And I froze because I didn't know her, and she said, "I need to talk to you about your husband." And my heart was racing, but I remembered my training from Torres. I stayed calm, I acted natural, and I said, "I'm sorry, do I know you?" And she glanced around nervously and said, Not here, there's a park 2 blocks from here, meet me there in 20 minutes, come alone. And then she was gone, disappeared into the crowd of shoppers, and I abandoned my cart and went straight to my car where I knew the FBI agents were listening through the wire I was wearing, and I said quietly, "You got that right, we have a contact." And I heard Torres's voice in my earpiece telling me to proceed to the park. They'd have agents positioned around the perimeter, I'd be safe. The park was small and nearly empty on that Wednesday afternoon, and I sat on a bench near the playground and waited, and the woman appeared from behind a cluster of trees and sat beside me, but not too close, and she said, "They told me to befriend you, to get close to you and find out what your husband knows." And I asked who they were, and she said, "The people who own me, the people who bought me when I was 16 and have been selling me ever since." And her voice was flat, affectless, like she'd told this story so many times it had lost its power to hurt her. And she said her name was Maria, and she'd been trafficked for 9 years, and she tried to escape twice and been punished severely both times, but recently she'd been assigned to their intelligence division, the girls they used.